At 2 o'clock in the morning in Brooklyn, the November rain struck the bakery window as though someone were knocking, and no one cared enough to open the door. Inside Miller's hearth, yellow light spilled across the old tile floor, and the scent of rising yeast and melting butter blended into the kind of fragrance only those who stay awake through the night ever truly know. In the corner of the kitchen, a young woman was kneading dough in silence, her brown hair pinned low with an old wooden clip, her thin hands moving with the steady rhythm of someone who had done this for 1,000 nights. No one knew her real name. No one knew who she had been before she appeared at the bakery door 4 years earlier, wearing a coat soaked through with rain and the eyes of someone who had just lost everything. To the whole of Greenpoint, she was only Rosie, the girl who baked through the night. Invisible, familiar, not worth remembering. Then the bakery door flew open. 3 men in soaked black suits stepped inside, one of them bleeding from the shoulder, and the man in the center, tall, wrapped in a charcoal wool coat, with steel-gray eyes, carried the kind of power that made the whole shop seem to stop breathing, though no one could have explained why. It was August Valentino, the most notorious Mafia boss in New York, the man federal agents had been chasing for 7 years without ever catching. He sat down at the wooden table in the corner, the very table where Rosie had placed a small espresso every night at 3 o'clock for 4 years, for someone who never came. She walked over, set the cup down, and turned away. He lifted it, drew in the first breath of its aroma, and the hand that had never trembled while giving orders to kill suddenly froze. Because that method of making coffee, 3 drops of warm water first, then 2 spoonfuls of freshly ground coffee, tamped with exactly 30 pounds of pressure, wasn't American, and it wasn't ordinary Italian either. It was the private formula of one single family in Naples, the family whose secrets, his wife, the woman he had buried 5 years earlier, had taken down into the grave with her. August set the cup back down, lifted his head, then quietly asked the girl who stood with her back to him, in the rough, deep accent of Naples, "Who taught you to make coffee like that?" Rosie stopped in the middle of the dough. She didn't turn around, and she answered in flawless Italian, a language she hadn't spoken in front of anyone in 4 years, her voice as soft as breath itself. "My mother, and her mother before her." Then she spoke the next 7 words that made Sonny, August's right hand, drop the gun he was trying to bandage onto the floor. 7 words that had never been written in any FBI file. 7 words that only 2 women in the world had ever known. One had died in 2020. The other was believed to have died in an accident in Vermont 8 years earlier. If you believe that some souls that seemed lost to each other forever still find their way back, through a cup of coffee, an old melody, a fateful rainy night, press like, share this story with those who are lonely in the night, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the stories that awaken your heart every single day. E il fratello guarda la stella sopra. Those 7 words fell into the small kitchen like 7 cold stones, dropping into the still surface of a lake. The white cloth that had been wrapped around Sonny's shoulder slipped from his fingers and drifted down to the tiled floor so softly that no one actually heard it land. Yet all 3 men in that little shop felt the sound ring inside their minds like a church bell. Sonny stood motionless in the middle of the room, one side of his shoulder still stained with blood, his mouth slightly open but unable to release a single sound. He had worked for the Valentino family for 16 years, had heard hundreds of conversations that even the federal courts would have needed a decade to decode, but never in his life had he heard those 7 words spoken outside the 4 walls of the Valentino villa on Long Island. Sonny knew that with absolute certainty, because he himself had stood guard outside the mistress's bedroom for the last 5 years of her life, and those 7 words had been whispered only on the nights when Celestina could not sleep, when she sat by the window looking out at the garden and called the name of the sister she missed so dearly. August did not move for a full 5 seconds. His right hand tightened around the wooden chair until his fingertips turned the color of wax. The gold ring engraved with the Valentino crest on his ring finger scraped against the wood and left behind a thin mark that later he would never allow anyone to repair. The steel-gray gaze in his eyes was no longer the gaze of the most feared boss in New York, but the gaze of a man who had just heard the voice of his dead wife echo back to him from a kitchen in Brooklyn at 2 o'clock in the morning. He had not cried at Celestina's funeral. He had not cried when he closed the lid of her coffin. He had not cried when he burned every love letter she had left behind in the dressing table drawer. But now, as 7 words from an old nursery rhyme once sung by 2 little girls in Naples on a stone staircase, sometime in the 1970s, rose from the lips of a girl he had never met. Something inside his chest split open along a fracture line, so small and so deep, in a place he had believed was reinforced by 6 years of silence and red wine. Rosie still did not turn around. Both of her hands kept kneading the dough with a rhythm so deeply learned that her body could have done it in sleep. Fold, press, turn, fold, press, turn. But if August could have seen her face in that moment, he would have seen her lips pressed tight, the small vein at her temple beating harder, and a single drop of sweat slipping quietly from her hairline into the white dough where no one would ever know it had fallen. She had not spoken those 7 words because she meant to. She had spoken them because when she heard the Italian voice of that stranger, some buried part of her, the part she had hidden for 8 long years, answered before reason could stop it. It was the reflex of a little girl who had been sung to sleep with that rhyme. It was the echo of winter nights in Vermont when her mother, Bianca, held her and Tobias close in the rocking chair by the fireplace, singing while she cried and never letting the children know that she was crying. August stood up, slowly. There was no sound in the movement except the faint scrape of the chair against the tiled floor. He took 5 steps toward the kitchen counter and stopped exactly 3 paces from Rosie. He said nothing. She said nothing. Sonny still stood frozen behind him as though encased in ice. Immy, back in the storage room, only a short distance from the wooden door, had stopped as well. One hand gripping the doorknob, the other pressed to her chest, listening to her heart pound like an alarm bell. The whole shop sank into a silence held together only by the rain outside and the steady sound of dough being kneaded beneath the thin hands of the girl, whose real name no one knew. That moment may have lasted no more than 10 seconds, but within those 10 seconds, 8 years in the lives of all 3 of them began to unwind back to the beginning. The yellow light from the old bulb hanging above the kitchen counter fell at a fixed angle, and in the moment, Rosie lowered her head a little deeper into the dough. The collar of her gray sweater shifted slightly toward her right shoulder, revealing a faint line along her left collarbone. The scar wasn't long, no more than the length of a little finger joint, a pale pink mark faded by time, yet clear enough for August to see from 3 steps away, and the instant he saw it, every bone in his body seemed to turn cold, as if an invisible hand had reached inside and drained the warmth from him. A memory he had believed buried beneath 8 layers of time rose whole and untouched. In 2015, one August afternoon, Celestina had sat on a stone bench in the garden of the Long Island estate, holding a photograph sent from Vermont, and she had cried, not from sorrow, but from a quiet, aching compassion. She had told August, her voice breaking in that familiar Neapolitan Italian, that her little niece, the only girl left carrying the Calandra bloodline in the next generation, had fallen down a wooden staircase at her sister's home, 16 years old. A wound along the left collarbone that required 4 or 5 stitches. Celestina had asked his permission to fly there, and he had agreed, had booked the ticket himself, had stood at the airport to see her off. When she returned 2 weeks later, she carried a photograph of the little girl smiling beside an old piano, and she had kept that photograph in her leather wallet until the final day of her life. August looked at the scar on Rosie's neck. Then he looked at her hands, still kneading the dough with that strange, steady rhythm, as if her body were clinging to the only thing in the room that hadn't begun to break apart. He opened his mouth. When his voice came out, it no longer belonged to the man who had commanded hundreds over 2 decades. It was rough, the edges fractured, like the voice of someone who hadn't spoken in days. He asked in English, "What is your real name?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement shaped into one. Rosie stopped moving. Dough clung to her 10 fingertips like thin white gloves. She let out a long, slow breath. And within that breath was the sound of 4 years of silence collapsing. Then she lifted her head. For the first time in 4 years since the night she had collapsed at the door of Miller's hearth in a rain-soaked coat with hands that could no longer feel, Rosie looked directly into a stranger's eyes. Her gray-blue gaze, which had learned to avoid every direct look so no one could read her, now met the steel-gray eyes of August Valentino, and in that moment, the 2 people standing 3 steps apart realized they were looking into the same mirror. "Rosemary Beckett," she said. 2 words. The surname of the American father from Vermont she had chosen to hide behind for 8 years. The name printed on the identification card Immy had quietly helped her legalize. The name written on the bakery payroll. The name the bank clerk used each month when she came to deposit her small savings. No one in Greenpoint knew any other name. Silence followed. Rosie swallowed. She held August's gaze for another second, then another, and something in his eyes told her she had gone too far to turn back. "But my mother," she continued, her voice so soft it almost dissolved into the air. "My mother used to call me Rosalia Calandra." The surname left her lips, and August stepped back. Not the cautious movement of a man choosing distance, but the recoil of someone struck in the chest by both hands at once. His back hit Sonny, who caught his arm on instinct, one hand still smeared with blood from his wounded shoulder. No one spoke. In the storage room, behind the door, Emmy had dropped to her knees, one hand pressed to her chest, silently making the sign of the cross. Rosie looked at the three men before her, and she understood, slowly and painfully, that they didn't just recognize the name Calandra. They had been searching for it for 8 years. Footsteps sounded from behind the wooden door leading to the storage room, slow, heavy, and hesitant enough to seem as though someone were walking through 8 years all at once. The door was pushed open with the familiar creak Rosie had heard thousands of times over the past 4 years. But tonight that sound was different. Imogen Hartwell stepped out, her worn slippers dragging lightly across the tile, her wrinkled hands still gripping the handle of the wooden broom she used every dawn to sweep flour from the floor. That 58-year-old woman, with most of her silver hair pinned neatly beneath an old blue cloth scarf, with her faded apron printed with cornflower blossoms washed pale over the years, with the warm brown eyes Rosie had learned to trust more than any other eyes in the world, stopped cold in the doorway when her gaze landed on the face of the tall man standing 3 steps from Rosie. The blood drained from Emmy's face in 2 seconds. Not a trace of pink remained in the cheeks that were usually flushed from the heat of the ovens. Her lips parted. The broom tilted 15 degrees in her hands before she tightened her grip again by reflex. And then, from deep in her throat, came a sentence in Italian. A sentence Rosie had never heard Emmy speak in 4 years. A sentence spoken in a low Neapolitan voice, damp and deep, as morning mist over the Tyrrhenian Sea. Augusto. Dopo tutti questi anni. Those last 4 words, dopo tutti questi anni, after all these years, stretched from her lips as though if she said them slowly enough, time itself might stop and she wouldn't have to face what stood before her. August turned toward her very slowly. Sonny, still supporting his elbow, turned as well. Rosie stood by the kitchen counter, both hands still dusted with flour, and she froze in a way her body didn't know how to answer. Emmy knew this man. Emmy had just called him by the intimate Italian name Augusto, the way only someone who had known him in youth would say it. Emmy knew how to speak Italian. Not once, not a single time in 4 years. Not while cooking, not while humming softly as she wiped down the counter, not while scolding little Mimi the cat for wandering into the storage room, had she ever let slip that Italian lived inside her throat like a first language. Rosie looked at Emmy, then at August, then back at Emmy. She said nothing. She had nothing to say, but her breathing began to shorten, and her lips pressed into that thin, straight line Emmy had learned over 4 years meant Rosie was trying not to come apart. Emmy saw it, and in that moment, all 3 emotions passed across her face at once, woven together so tightly they couldn't be separated. Relief, because at last the secret she had carried for 4 years would no longer sit on her chest like a stone. Guilt, because she could see in Rosie's eyes the look of a child who has just discovered that the grown-ups have lied. And fear, an old fear, the fear she had promised Celestina she would keep alive in her heart, the fear that once Rosie stepped back into that other world, she would no longer remain Rosie. Emmy drew a deep breath. She bent down and set the broom carefully against the wall, as though placing it in exactly the right spot was the last thing still under her control tonight. Then she straightened, her hands clasped tightly before her apron, trembling faintly at the knuckles. She looked at Rosie, not like a shop owner looking at an employee, not like an older woman looking at a younger one, but like a mother looking at a daughter who was finally about to learn the truth she had hidden all her life. "Sit down, Rosie." Emmy's voice broke on the final word. "It's time." Rosie looked at her for 1 more second, a second longer than any second she had ever lived through. Then she untied her apron slowly, folded it into a neat square, set it on the counter beside the unfinished dough, and walked toward the wooden table in the corner. 4 people, 4 fates that had been lost from one another for nearly a decade, sat down together around a table where for 4 years there had always been a cold cup of coffee waiting at the head, waiting for someone who never came. Emmy sat across from Rosie, both hands resting on the wooden table worn to a soft caramel tone after decades of being wiped clean with damp cloths. And she didn't know where to begin. August sat to her left, Sunny at the head of the table, and Rosie sat opposite her with unblinking eyes. The espresso Rosie had prepared for August remained where it had been placed, the steam long gone, yet no one reached for it anymore. Imi drew a long breath, and the first words she spoke were not in English. She spoke in Italian, because there are truths that cannot be carried in a second language. She said that she and Celestina had grown up together on the same stone street in Naples, in 2 houses separated by only 3 steps, and they had shared a single brass hair clip through 12 years of childhood. She said that when Celestina was 19 and she was 21, their paths split. Imi followed her husband to Brooklyn. Celestina remained in Naples waiting for the man she would love for the rest of her life, and she said that on the day Celestina married August, she had flown back to stand beside her friend in an ivory bridesmaid dress, and she had cried more than the bride herself. Then Imi stopped. She shifted into English, because what came next belonged to Rosie. 4 years ago, on a February night, the rain was heavier than tonight. The shop had closed at 10 o'clock. I was upstairs when I heard a sound at the door. Not quite a knock, more like someone collapsing against it. I came down, opened it, and there was a girl lying on the threshold. Her coat soaked through, her lips blue. No bag, no wallet, nothing except a small silver necklace tight against her throat. I pulled you inside and wrapped you in blankets for 3 hours before you opened your eyes. Imi paused. She looked at Rosie, and her brown eyes filled with tears. I was going to call an ambulance, but when I took your coat off to dry you, the necklace slipped free, and I saw the 2 initials engraved on the back, R and C, and I knew in that moment who you were, because I had seen that necklace around Celestina's neck for 30 years before she sent it to her sister when her first daughter was born. Rosie didn't move. Her hands rested on her knees beneath the table, her fingers pressing hard into the fabric against her skin, but no one could see it. Her face remained so calm that August, a man who had spent his life reading others under pressure, felt a chill run along his spine. Imi continued. She said she hadn't told anyone, not the police, not a hospital, not even August, because 2 years earlier, on a May afternoon in 2020, she had sat beside Celestina's bed in the Long Island estate, and Celestina, her breath already counted one by one, had taken her wrist and asked for one final promise. If one day, Celestina had whispered in Italian, little Rosalia is still somewhere in this world, and if fate brings her close to you, Imi, then please, don't let Augusto know. Never. His world took my sister from me. I have cried 2 years for Bianca and the children. I cannot bear to lose Rosalia as well. Let her live a normal life. Just once. In all the Calandra bloodline. Let one child live normally. Imi stopped speaking. Tears slipped down her lined cheeks. She looked at August. Not to ask forgiveness. Not to defend herself. But simply to let him understand that promise had been the only reason she had kept the last living niece of his wife hidden from him for 4 years. Rosie still said nothing. Her eyes weren't red. Her shoulders didn't tremble. She sat there like a statue carved from marble, and only the small vein at her temple pulsed steadily, like a second heart trying to keep the first from breaking. August didn't argue. He didn't say Celestina had been wrong. He didn't say she had misunderstood him. He simply lowered his head and looked at the wooden table, and under the dim yellow light, the 3 people sitting with Rosie realized that the most powerful man in New York had just accepted, in silence, the judgment of his dead wife. Rosie was the first to speak. Her voice was dry, flat, without pitch. She looked down at the grain of the wood on the tabletop, following a dark brown line that ran from the edge nearest her all the way toward August, and she told her story along that grain, as if the moment her eyes left it, she would no longer be able to continue. On Christmas Eve in 2018, she was 19 years old, a second-year student in classical piano at Juilliard. She had just finished performing in the school's winter concert, and her family had driven down from Vermont to New York to bring her home for the holiday. Her father, Henry Beckett, 54 years old, was driving the old moss-green Volvo the family had used for 12 years. Her mother, Bianca, sat in the front passenger seat. Her younger brother, Tobias, 14, sat behind their father, his head resting against the window, earphones in, listening on his phone to a recording Rosie had made for him the day before. Rosie sat behind her mother. Darkness had already fallen by 4 in the afternoon. Snow was coming down lightly, not enough to freeze the road, but enough to muffle every sound outside. They were on a mountain road in New York State, still 2 hours from Vermont, when a pair of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror and began growing larger with terrifying speed. Her father looked into the mirror, and in his voice there was only one word Rosie had carried with her for 8 years, one word she still had not dared to whisper even when she was completely alone. He said, "Bianca." That was all. The impact came from behind, violent enough to send the Volvo skidding sideways into the opposite lane, and when her father tried to wrench the wheel back, the tires had already left the road. Rosie remembered the sound of glass shattering. She remembered her mother calling her name one single time. She remembered the sensation of her body turning upside down in space. Then darkness. She woke 2 weeks later in the intensive care unit of a hospital in Albany. A nurse named Margaret had been sitting beside her bed when she opened her eyes for the first time. Margaret was the one who told her the rest. Her father and younger brother had died at the scene before the ambulance even arrived. Her mother had been found still breathing, brought to the hospital, and died 4 hours later from internal injuries that could not be saved. During those 4 hours, Bianca had remained conscious for roughly the final 15 minutes. She had clutched Margaret's hand and whispered a single sentence into the young nurse's ear, repeating it 3 times until she was sure Margaret had heard. "Don't let the Valentino family know the girl is still alive. Please, don't let them know." Then she died. Margaret kept that promise. Rosie's name was changed in the hospital records to Rosemary Beckett, using her father's surname, and in the death certificates for the family, her name was listed alongside the other 3. She was dead, according to every record that existed in this world. Rosie stopped speaking. She lifted her head for the first time during the whole story and looked directly into August's eyes. "My mother said your people were the reason. For 8 years, I have lived with that sentence every night." August said nothing. He placed both hands on the table, pushed his chair back, and stood. He walked to the bakery window, where raindrops were still sliding down the glass in uneven parallel lines. He stood with his back to the other 3 for nearly half a minute, and when he turned back, his face had darkened by a shade. "It wasn't my men," he said, his voice low and steady. "The truck that night belonged to Silvio Marchetti, boss of the Chicago family, the man whose blood feud with the Calandra family went back 3 generations. He had been tracking Bianca from the day she left Naples in 2002. He waited for that night because he knew the whole family would be together on the road home." August paused. He swallowed once. 2 years later, he found a way to get close to Celestina. She was not sick the way the newspapers claimed. She was poisoned. It took me 21 days to uncover who was behind it, and I ended everything with Silvio 3 days after my wife's funeral, in a cabin outside Milwaukee. He has not been anyone's problem since that day. He looked at Rosie. His eyes no longer belonged to a boss. "I thought you had died in that crash too. For 8 years, I have lit a candle for you every Christmas. In Naples, in the little church where your mother was baptized. That candle is still burning tonight." August returned to his chair. He sat down slowly, like a man forced to set each bone back into place inside his own body. He slipped a hand inside his coat, and the movement made Sonny lean forward by reflex, an instinct worn into him after 16 years on the job. But what August drew out was not a weapon. It was a dark brown leather wallet, the edges frayed at all 4 corners, and under the yellow light of the bakery it looked like an object that had passed through many decades and many lives. He opened it, very slowly, and from the innermost compartment, the place people usually reserve for what matters most, he pulled out a small photograph. The picture had yellowed with age, its edges worn so thin they looked almost ready to dissolve. He placed it on the wooden table and pushed it toward Rosie with the tip of his index finger, moving it only so far before stopping it halfway between them. Rosie looked at the photograph without moving for 5 seconds. In it, a little girl of about 8 years old, brown hair braided into 2 small plaits, sat on a piano bench so high for her that she had to stretch her feet just to reach the pedals. Her tiny hands rested on the ivory keys, and her face was turned toward the woman sitting beside her, her mouth open in the kind of smile only children know how to give, a smile without conditions, without memory, without fear. The woman beside her had long black hair falling over her shoulders, eyes framed by thick lashes, and she was looking at the little girl with a love Rosie had never seen captured in any other photograph in this world. It was Celestina, and the little girl beside her, wearing the cream-colored knitted dress Rosie's mother had spent 3 months making before that trip, was Rosalia Calandra, 8 years old, in the only moment of her life when she had ever met her aunt. Rosie reached out. Her fingertips touched the edge of the photograph. She pulled it toward herself so slowly that it almost seemed to move on its own. And when the picture lay fully beneath her eyes, both of her hands began to tremble, not violently, just the smallest trembling, beginning at the tip of her little finger, traveling up to her wrist, and stopping at her elbow. But it was the first trembling her body had allowed itself in 4 years. Celestina kept this photograph in her wallet until her last day, August said. His voice was so soft Rosie almost did not hear it. Every night before she slept, she took it out and looked at it. I thought she did that because she missed Naples. But now I understand. She was looking at you. She looked at you every night for 6 years. Rosie said nothing. A tear fell, not from the corner of her eye but from her lashes, and it did not roll down her cheek the way tears usually do. It fell straight down, landing on the photograph, on the shoulder of the little 8-year-old girl. And Rosie quickly wiped it away with her thumb, as if she were afraid of damaging the picture, afraid of hurting the little girl inside it, afraid of hurting herself from 19 years earlier. Then another tear came. She did not wipe that one away. She let it slide down her cheek and fall onto the wooden table, where it sank into the grain and disappeared as though it had never existed. She lifted her head. My mother taught me to make coffee that way, every Sunday morning, since I was 6 years old. She set a little stool beside the stove so I could stand next to her, and she counted every drop of water out loud for me. Her voice was no longer dry. It had broken somewhere in the telling. She told me that was how my grandmother had taught her, and she said that one day I would teach it to my daughter. But she never told me why she was afraid. She never told me why every time I asked about Naples, she changed the subject. I don't understand. I don't understand why she was afraid of her own family. August did not answer at once. He looked at Rosie across the photograph lying between them, and he understood that some questions are not asked in order to receive an answer, but simply to be heard out loud. Rosie stayed silent for a long while after her own question. She looked at the photograph one more time, then set it down in the middle of the table, not pushing it back toward August, not keeping it for herself, only leaving it there like a mute piece of evidence. Then, her gaze slipped away from the photograph, traveled along the wooden tabletop, over the tiny scratches she had memorized one by one over the past 4 years, and came to rest at the head of the table on August's right, where the cold espresso still sat. The crema collapsed into a dark brown ring clinging to the porcelain. She looked at that cup of coffee for a very long time. Long enough that Sonny, a man who had never been good at enduring long silences, had to turn his eyes away. And when she finally spoke, her voice was so soft that the other 3 had to stop breathing in order to hear it. I place an espresso there every night, she said. Every night, at 3 o'clock in the morning. For 4 years. Amy went still. She had known this. Of course she had known. She was the owner of the shop, and nothing could happen inside those walls without her knowing. But hearing Rosie say it aloud, on this night, in front of this man, was something entirely different. I don't know why, Rosie continued. She did not look at anyone. Her eyes stayed fixed on the cup. On my first night working here, Imi told me to make her an espresso. So I did. But when I was about to bring it to her, something, I don't know what else to call it, made me stop and make a second one. Then I walked to this table and set it at the head. I didn't think. My hands just did it. And the next morning, when I saw the cup still there, cold, untouched, I cried. I didn't know why I was crying. I just cried. Then the next night, I made another one. And the night after that. 4 years. Over 1,700 nights. I have never forgotten a single one. Imi covered her mouth with both hands. Tears were already running down her face, and she no longer tried to hide them. A small sob escaped her. And then she whispered in Italian, the kind of sentence only those who had grown up on the stone streets of Naples could fully understand. Il caffè per chi non c'è. Coffee for the one who is not here. She turned toward Rosie and went on in English, the tears making her voice rough. Your grandmother, old Serafina, did that every night for the last 31 years of her life after your grandfather died young. 1 espresso placed at the head of the table, brewed with exactly 3 drops of water first. 2 spoonfuls of freshly ground coffee, tamped with exactly 30 pounds of pressure. Never a single night missed. It was a ritual of the Calandra family, A way of calling the dead back home. A way of telling the universe that we have not forgotten. Celestina did it too. After Bianca died, she made 1 espresso every night at the Long Island estate, set it at the dining table in the morning room, and sat with it until sunrise. She did that for 2 years, without missing a single night, until she no longer had the strength to rise from bed. Emmy turned back to Rosie. Her tears fell onto the wooden table, and she did not wipe them away. No one taught you that ritual, Rosie. No one could have taught it. It is not a lesson. It is something passed down through the things that are never spoken aloud. You did it because you are a Calandra. You did it every night for 4 years, and you did not know it, but you were calling your aunt and your grandmother back to this bakery. You were keeping a path open so their souls would know the way home. Rosie did not cry anymore. At some point, her tears had stopped, and in their place something very still had settled inside her eyes. She looked at the cup of coffee. She looked at the table. She looked at the chair where August was sitting. The chair she had straightened every morning for 4 years, even though no one had ever sat there. And slowly she understood that she had been waiting for someone she had never known she was waiting for. August said nothing. He could not say anything. His hand rested on the table, and in the weak yellow light of the bakery at 3 o'clock in the morning, everyone saw him close his eyes once, for a very long time. That moment lasted exactly 7 seconds more. 7 seconds in which the 4 people sitting around the wooden table allowed themselves to believe that tonight might end with tears and an old photograph, and not with anything else. Then came the sound of breaking glass at the front door. Not the sound of wind or an accident. It was the sound of something deliberate, decisive, one hard strike that sent the lower pane of the wooden door splintering into a web of cracks, before collapsing onto the tiled floor in hundreds of small shards. Sonny was on his feet before the sound had even finished. He had long ago learned to hear danger before his mind had time to name it, and tonight that instinct saved the lives of the other 3. In 2 seconds, he had pulled August out of the chair and shoved him toward the wall behind the kitchen counter, into the blind corner no one at the front door could see. His left hand, though still bleeding beneath the bandage, drew something from inside his coat and held it close against his thigh, not raised, but ready. Emmy rose by reflex, but her legs carried her nowhere. She only stood there, one hand gripping the edge of the table, staring toward the door. Rosie was the only one who did not move. She remained seated in her chair, both hands resting on her lap, her expression unnervingly calm, as though some part of her had known for a long time that this was coming. The shop door swung open. 4 men stepped inside at once, all wearing black raincoats that fell to their knees, rainwater dripping from the hems onto the tiled floor Emmy had scrubbed clean with her own hands the afternoon before. They carried with them not only the cold of a Brooklyn November night, but something else too. The smell of men who had already moved through 3 or 4 businesses tonight and still had not collected enough money to go home. The 3 men in back were of average build, their faces half hidden beneath their hoods, and in their hands were long metal objects, the sort the people in this neighborhood had learned never to ask too many questions about. The man in front was tall and lean, soaked enough that his hair clung flat to his scalp, his collar open to reveal the tattoo running from his jaw down to his collarbone, a strand of barbed wire inked in faded black. He carried nothing in his hands. He didn't need to. He entered the shop the way a man enters his own sitting room, then let his eyes sweep the place in one quick, practiced motion, counting bodies, marking positions, before stopping on Emmy. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, his voice soft, almost polite. "You're 11 days late this month. Mr. Rafferty doesn't like being kept waiting." The man at the front did not notice Sonny standing in the blind corner behind the counter. He did not see August, because August stood in a position outside his line of sight. To him, tonight was simply the 11th night in a territory expansion campaign Rafferty Donnelly had begun the week before, a campaign meant to pull 73 small businesses in Greenpoint, Williamsburg, and Bushwick onto his payroll, all the places the Valentino family had neglected over the past 6 years while chasing larger prizes in Manhattan. Miller's Hearth was only the 9th name on tonight's list, a bakery owned by an old woman, run through the night by a silent girl. The easiest, the quickest. Emmy could not speak. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no sound came out. For 4 years, she had grown used to paying in full and on time to other collectors, men from a different line, quieter, more orderly. She did not know when Rafferty had changed the arrangement. and she did not understand why this month was the one she had supposedly missed. The man in front turned his head and looked at Rosie. He looked her up and down with the same gaze Rosie had encountered many times over the past 4 years, whenever she delivered bread before dawn. The gaze of men who did not see her as a person but as an object being priced. He gave a crooked smile, one corner of his mouth lifting to reveal the slightly crooked tooth on the right. "And the little lady," he said. "I'm sure you'll help your boss remember where the money is, won't you?" Rosie did not answer. She rose from the chair very slowly, carefully enough that the chair made no sound against the tile, and stepped forward until she stood between the 4 men and Emmy. In the blind corner behind the counter, August opened his eyes. Rosie stood between the tattooed man and Emmy, her shoulders straight in a way Emmy had never seen in her in 4 years. Not straight because she was trying, straight because something inside her had settled back into its proper place. Perhaps from the moment the cold espresso on the table had finally been given a name. Perhaps even earlier, perhaps from that night in Vermont, when a 19-year-old girl had not died the way she should have died. She looked directly into the man's eyes, and her voice, when she spoke, was no longer the voice of Rosie the night baker. It was even. It was clear. It carried the weight of 4 years of flour and sweat pressing down on her narrow shoulders. "She has already paid for this month," she said. "You have the wrong information. I suggest you check again with whoever collected last week, and leave the shop." The man at the front stopped half a step short. He looked at her as if he were staring at something that had not been included in the script he had prepared for tonight. In the past 11 nights, in the 9 shops before this one, not a single person had dared stand in his path. Women cried, men handed over money, shop owners called to beg for more time, but no one had stood still and spoken to him in the voice of someone who had decided there was nothing left to lose. In the very instant he was trying to process that, irritation overcame surprise, and he took one long step toward Rosie. His right arm came up, his palm open, level with her cheek. He did not strike her at once. He only raised his hand there, like a final warning. Behind Rosie, Emmy let out a sharp breath. In the corner, Sonny tightened his fingers around the thing inside his coat. But none of the 3 had time to act, because from the blind corner behind the kitchen counter, there came a movement. Very small, very slow. August stepped forward. Just one step. A single step that brought him out of the darkness behind the counter and onto the section of tile touched by the yellow light from the hanging bulb above. He said nothing. He drew nothing from inside his coat. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, both feet set parallel, both arms hanging straight at his sides, his charcoal overcoat still damp with rain at the shoulders, and the yellow light, that weak light beneath which Rosie had worked every night for 4 years, fell across his face at exactly the angle it needed to fall tonight. The gold ring engraved with the family crest on the ring finger of his right hand caught the light once, only once. His steel-gray eyes were not looking at the man in front. They were looking through him, toward some point beyond the back of his head, as if the man no longer existed in this room at all, as if he had already become something August was deciding what to do with. The man at the front saw him. For exactly a quarter of a second, his face did not process what it was seeing. Then his mind caught up, his eyes widened, his mouth opened, and somewhere in his throat, a small sound escaped him. Not a word, not a breath, but the kind of sound a human body makes only when it realizes it has crossed too far beyond a line it was never supposed to touch. The 3 men behind him did not yet understand what was happening. They looked at the back of their leader, looked at the man in the dark overcoat who had just stepped out, then looked at one another. One of the 3, the youngest, barely 4 months into the crew, took half a step backward by reflex. Another lowered the long metal object in his hand until it brushed his thigh, as if to make certain it was still there. But the man at the front did not move anymore. He stood there with his arm still half raised in the air, the arm that would have touched Rosie's cheek if August had been 3 seconds slower. He swallowed once. Then the thing in his hand, a metal bar about half a meter long that he always kept tucked under his coat, like a badge of his profession, slipped from fingers that had suddenly gone numb and fell to the tile floor with a sharp, clean sound that echoed through the whole shop. No one picked it up. No one moved. Only the rain outside kept falling, steady and indifferent, as if the world beyond the 4 walls at number 42 Nassau Street had no idea what had just happened inside. August did not take another step. He did not need to. He stood exactly where the yellow light fell across his face, and he spoke in a voice that stayed level, never rising by a single note, never dropping by a single note. The voice of a man reciting dishes from a menu for a waiter to write down. "You are standing inside my family's shop." The first sentence dropped into the space of the bakery like a stone lowered into a deep well. The man at the front did not breathe. The youngest man behind him was breathing far too fast. "You have just threatened my blood." The second sentence. The phrase "my blood" was not spoken in English but in Neapolitan Italian, sangue mio, and the way those two words touched the air told the four men that tonight they had not stepped into an ordinary bakery, they had stepped into a part of a family that, for 3 decades, had ensured that those who laid hands on it did not return home on their own feet. Rosie heard those words. She heard August call her his blood in front of 4 strangers on the first night they had ever met, and something inside her chest tightened so hard that she could not tell whether it was pain or something else she still had no name for. "Leave this place in 2 minutes," August went on, "and never set foot in this neighborhood again." The third sentence was not a threat. It was an administrative instruction, a statement of what would happen next, delivered by a man who had already calculated every possibility. The man at the front did not need to be told twice. He stepped back once, then once more, his eyes never leaving August, his arm still half raised because he had forgotten it was there. One of the 3 behind him turned and fled before the leader had even pivoted, moving so fast that his shoulder slammed into the open doorframe with a hard crack that he no longer had enough feeling left to register. The youngest one, the boy who had been with the crew for only 4 months, caught his foot on the edge of the doormat at the threshold and dropped to one knee on the floor, scrambled back up without even brushing off the shards of broken glass clinging to his trouser leg, then bolted out the door so quickly that his hood fell back onto his shoulders, revealing the face of a boy not yet 20, pale as paper, eyes red from rain, and from something else he would never admit to anyone afterward. Within 90 seconds, all 4 had vanished through the doorway, leaving behind only the sound of running footsteps on the wet sidewalk, the roar of a car engine starting too fast at the end of the block, and the rain continuing to fall over the broken glass at the threshold. Sonny stepped out from the blind corner. He walked to the long metal object lying on the floor, bent down, picked it up with 3 fingers as though lifting something filthy, and set it neatly at the head of the wooden table, parallel to the cold espresso cup. The movement was so clean and exact that no one in the room noticed that his shoulder was still bleeding through the bandage. Amy dropped heavily into the nearest chair, both hands shaking so badly they had become their own tremor, and she lifted her apron to her face to wipe it, though there were no tears there anymore. She simply needed her hands to have something to do. Rosie did not sit down. She remained standing in the spot where she had stood to shield Amy, and she turned her head to look at August. There was no fear in her eyes, no anger, no gratitude. It was something far more complicated, a look she had spent 4 years teaching herself never to let another person see, the look of someone who had just witnessed 2 truths at the same moment. For the first time in her life, she had seen exactly what her mother Bianca had feared so deeply that she had spent the last 4 hours of her life begging a strange nurse never to speak of it. And for the first time in her life, she had seen exactly why her Aunt Celestina, lying in that bed on Long Island in 2020, had taken Amy by the wrist and begged her to keep Rosie far away from this man. Rosie said nothing. She only looked at August for 1 second more, then turned away, walked back toward the kitchen counter, and began gathering the broken glass from the floor with her bare hands. Rosie finished gathering the broken glass into the small dustpan Amy kept beneath the counter, but she didn't throw it away. She left it there on the floor beside the base of the kitchen counter and stood up. Both of her hands came to rest on the edge of the stainless steel surface, polished so clean it held a faint reflection of the yellow light above, and she leaned her weight forward just slightly, as though that narrow strip of metal was the only thing keeping her upright in that moment. She didn't turn toward the wooden table, didn't turn toward August, but she didn't lower her head either. She looked straight ahead at the wall where the old wooden board of measuring tools still hung, the same ones Amy had carried from Naples to Brooklyn in 1989. "Mr. Valentino," she said. 2 words. The first time that night she had spoken his name. Not Augusto, the intimate name Amy had used. Not Uncle, the name she would one day learn to say. Just his surname, spoken in English, precise and cold, like a name read from a television report. "Have you done the things the newspapers say you have done?" The question entered the air of the bakery at 3:40 in the morning and left August no path to step around it. Sonny, standing near the door, turned his head toward his boss. Amy lifted her gaze from her chair at the table. August did not answer immediately. He had returned to his seat when Sunny stepped forward to retrieve the metal object from the floor, and now he sat facing Rosie's back. He looked at the brown hair gathered low with an old wooden clip, at the narrow shoulders beneath the faded gray sweater, and he knew that if he lied to her tonight, he would lose her before he had ever truly had her. "There are things I have had to do," he said. "Nothing more, nothing less." His voice was low and slow, without excuse, without evasion. "For money?" Rosie asked, still not turning. "Sometimes," he replied. "For family, more often. For the men who follow me, the ones with wives and children waiting at home, the ones who would not live to see tomorrow if I hesitated. Sometimes for people who have no voice in this world and need someone else to speak for them. But I won't tell you that everything I have done was right. I won't lie about that. Not to you. Not tonight." Rosie fell silent for a moment. Her fingers tightened on the steel edge, the tips turning white the way a person grips a rope to keep from being pulled under. Then she asked the next question, the one Emmy would later remember with trembling shoulders, because she had waited for it for 4 years. "If I truly am your niece, what do you want from me?" August did not answer. The silence stretched long enough that Sunny had to look away. Emmy lifted her hand to touch the chain beneath her collar, a gesture she only made when she thought of Celestina. The yellow light above the counter flickered once, then steadied again. When August finally spoke, his voice was no longer the same as before. It was no longer the voice of a boss answering a challenge. It was the voice of a man who had spent too many years alone in a house too large on Long Island. "I don't want anything," he said. "I have had everything a man can have in this world. Money, power, respect, fear. I have had all of it, and none of it has meant anything to me since the day I closed the lid of my wife's coffin. I don't want anything from you, Rosalia. I only want to know that you are still breathing. I only want you to live, and I want you to know, from this night forward, that you are not alone in this world anymore. Whether you choose to let me walk out that door and never return, or you choose another path, that does not change. You still have someone." Rosie stood very still for a long time after that. She did not turn. She did not speak. Then she released the edge of the steel counter, reached for the folded apron, slipped it back over her neck, tied it behind her back, and pulled the unfinished dough toward herself. Her hands settled onto it, and she began to knead. Fold, press, turn, fold, press, turn. The same rhythm she had known for 4 years. No one in the shop moved toward her. No one said anything, because the other 3 understood that Rosie was kneading the dough not because bread needed to be made. She was kneading so her shoulders would not shake, so her hands would have something to do while another part of her was breaking into pieces no one was allowed to see. Outside the window, the sky had begun to change. The pitch black of 3 o'clock in the morning had given way to a pale gray. Not yet enough to be called dawn, but enough for the outlines of the buildings across the street to appear faintly against the sky. The November rain had softened, changing from dense drops striking the glass into scattered ones falling onto the wet pavement without sound. August rose from the wooden table. He stood slowly, like a man carrying on his shoulders the weight of a night far longer than the hours it had actually contained. He fastened the top 2 buttons of his charcoal coat, straightened the collar, and his eyes passed once over Rosie's back. Only once, before he turned to Sunny. Sunny nodded, understanding without words. He went to the front door, checked both sides of the sidewalk, then stepped back inside and said quietly in Italian, "The street is clear, sir." Emmy was still seated at the table. She did not rise to see him out. She only looked at August, and August looked at her, and neither of them spoke, because they had known each other long enough to understand that some moments must be left alone inside their own silence. He gave her the smallest nod, and she returned one even smaller. 40 years of friendship through Celestina were returned to each other in those 2 wordless gestures. Before stepping out, August paused beside the wooden table. He slipped a hand into the inside pocket of his coat and drew out a small calling card, ivory white, with sharp square corners. No logo, no address, no title. He placed it face down on the table beside the espresso that had long since gone cold, exactly in the spot where for 4 years no other object had ever been allowed to appear. Then he turned it over. On the face of the card there were only 2 things. A telephone number written by hand in black ink, the handwriting slow and straight, the hand of a man who had learned to write with a fountain pen in a school run by Naples clergy. And beneath the number, a sentence in Italian, 4 words, written in the same hand, though the final stroke trembled slightly on the last letter. Quando sarai pronta? He said nothing to Rosie. He did not wait for her to turn around. He did not look at her again. He only set the card down, nudged it inward across the table by half a finger's width, and turned away. Sonny opened the door for him. The little brass bell hanging from the frame rang out once, clear and bright, a sound so familiar to Rosie that she had long ago stopped hearing it, yet tonight it sounded strange. Then the door closed. Then the footsteps of the two men faded along the wet sidewalk. Then the engine of a black car came to life at the end of the street, rolled away, and disappeared around the corner. Then silence. Rosie remained standing at the kitchen counter. Her hands were still dusted with flour, the dry white powder already beginning to cake on the backs of them because the moisture had slowly evaporated while she wasn't noticing. She did not turn at once. She stood there for a long while longer, listening as the bakery finally returned to the silence that belonged to it, listening to her own breathing grow steady again after so many hours of not being steady. Then she turned, very slowly, and walked to the wooden table. She bent down to look at the card without touching it. The phone number, the 4 Italian words. When you are ready. There was no word must, no word should, no date, no promise. Only a possibility left behind on the surface of a wooden table, giving her complete power to decide whether it would continue to exist. Amy rose from her chair. She crossed the tiled floor and came to stand behind Rosie, saying nothing. She only opened her arms, wrapped them around the younger woman's shoulders from behind, pressed her cheek against her back, and held her there. Rosie did not resist. She did not lean into the embrace either. She only stood still and let Amy hold her, and the two women remained that way in the empty bakery, without a word, without a sob, only 2 streams of tears sliding down 2 faces separated by 31 years, soaking into each other's shoulders, with neither of them wiping the tears away. Outside the door, the rain had stopped completely. 3 days. Over those 3 days, Miller's hearth returned to its ordinary rhythm, or at least to the outer shell of that rhythm. The broken pane in the door was replaced the next morning by an old craftsman named Mateus, who asked no questions beyond the price, and by afternoon the shop no longer carried any visible trace of that November night, except for the ivory calling card still lying face down on the wooden table in the corner, where Amy did not dare touch it and Rosie did not want to. During the day, Rosie slept. At night, she worked. She kneaded dough, baked bread, packed ciabatta loaves for the delivery van at 4 o'clock in the morning, swept the floor, wiped the counter, checked inventory for the next day, doing everything her hands had learned so well over 4 years they could have done it in sleep. But one thing had changed. Each night, when the wall clock struck exactly 3, when she stood before the old espresso machine and reached for the small porcelain cup, her hand stopped. She would stand there for 2 minutes, sometimes 3, sometimes 5. She would look at the machine. She would look at the cup. She would look at the bag of ground coffee she had prepared at 10 o'clock that night. Then she would brew it, but she no longer carried it to the wooden table in the corner. She set it on the kitchen counter and let it grow cold there until morning. 3 nights in a row, 3 cups of espresso that went nowhere. On the second day, Amy brought out an old folder she had kept hidden at the bottom of a storage cabinet for 4 years. Inside were newspaper clippings she had cut from the New York Times, the Daily News, Corriere della Sera, and a small Italian magazine called La Voce di Napoli, all arranged in chronological order, all carrying the same name in their headlines: August Valentino, the shadow boss of Red Hook, the man federal investigators had pursued for 7 years without enough evidence to prosecute. The figure rumored to control 3 ports in southeastern Brooklyn. Rosie read each article. She read slowly, skipping nothing. And when she finished, she said nothing. She closed the folder, set it down, and looked at Amy. Amy sat across from her with a cup of mint tea gone cold in her hands. "That is what they write," she said. "But it is not everything. There are things no one writes." Then Amy told her, briefly, without embellishment. She spoke of Naples, of a poor district called Quartieri Spagnoli, where 4 clinics had been built with funds from a charity called Fondazione Celestina, open 24 hours a day to anyone who could not afford treatment. She spoke of 200 children in Brooklyn receiving music scholarships each year from a foundation that never named its donor. Children learning piano, violin, cello at schools their parents could never have paid for. She did not say more. She only said, "A person has 2 hands, Rosie. You look at what both hands have done, and then you decide." Rosie did not answer. She went into the storage room, closed the door, and sat on the concrete floor in the dark for 40 minutes. On the third night, after Emmy had gone upstairs to sleep, Rosie stepped away from the counter, walked past the wooden table without looking at the card, and crossed to the far corner of the shop, where an old, upright piano stood in walnut wood, covered in a thin layer of dust. The piano had been there before she arrived, and in 4 years she had never touched it. Emmy had never asked why. Rosie stopped in front of it. She looked at the lid, dulled by dust and time. Then she lifted her hand, slowly, and placed her index finger on middle C. She did not press it. She only touched. The coolness of the ivory key traveled through her fingertip, across the back of her hand, along her wrist, and settled somewhere in her chest that she had kept locked for 8 years. She withdrew her hand. She did not press the key. She did not play. She stood there a moment longer, looking at the instrument the way one looks at a familiar face after too many years apart, not yet ready to speak its name. Then she turned back to the counter and resumed her work for the night. The fourth night arrived with the first true north wind of winter. Brooklyn no longer had rain, but the temperature had dropped below freezing, and the sidewalk was covered in a thin glaze of frost that caught the streetlights in trembling yellow streaks. At 11:50 that night, Rosie was kneading the third batch of dough for the next day's bread. Emmy was counting the cash drawer at the front counter, and then the bell over the shop door rang. Not one person walking in. 7. They entered all at once, not hurried, not sneaking, but with the calm of men who knew they were arriving somewhere the owner had no power to refuse. 6 of them in black leather jackets formed 2 lines of 3 behind the 7th. And the 7th, the one in front, was a man of 42, tall and lean, with short pale red hair, a dark blue tailored suit cut close at the waist, and eyes so pale blue that to look straight into them made a person think of broken ice. Rafferty Donnelly, boss of the Irish line in North Brooklyn. The man who over the past 18 months had swallowed 4 neighborhoods the Valentino family had neglected, and the man who had decided tonight that he had come to swallow one more piece. Rafferty did not look at Emmy first. He looked at Rosie. He had heard her described by the 19-year-old boy, the one who had run screaming from the bakery on Sunday night and had not dared return to work for the 3 days after. That boy had cried while telling the story, and in his crying Rafferty had heard the name August Valentino and had seen the face of the Italian boss he had not met directly in 7 years. A Valentino Don does not come personally to an old Neapolitan woman's bakery at 2 in the morning unless there is something inside more valuable than bread. Rafferty had needed exactly 4 days to fit the pieces together, and the last piece dropped into place when one of his men, a man who had once worked for the Marchetti bloodline before switching loyalties, recognized the name Calandra in the broken story the boy had repeated. "Mrs. Hartwell," Rafferty called. His voice was light and clear. The Irish accent faded after 2 decades in America, but still leaving its mark on certain sounds. "How many years have you been running this shop now?" Emmy stood still behind the counter. Her hand came to rest on the cash drawer as it closed, very slowly. She did not answer. Rafferty did not need an answer. He took 3 steps into the center of the bakery, 4 of his men following and spreading into a fan shape, while the other 2 blocked the door. No one drew anything from inside their coats. They did not need to. The presence of 7 bodies inside that small shop was enough to leave no room for escape. Rafferty moved around the kitchen counter. He walked toward Emmy. He did not raise a hand, did not raise his voice, but the way he stepped, the slight tilt of his head forward, the fact that he did not blink, was the way a beast approaches prey it has already decided will not get away. Emmy stepped back once. Her back touched the brick wall behind her. Rafferty stopped half a meter from her. 4 nights ago, he said, "My men came to visit your shop. They ran into a small complication. A friend of yours intervened. I came tonight to ask after that friend, and to invite the girl standing behind you to come with me for a little ride. Just one ride. We'll return her safely after I've had a chance to speak with your friend." Rosie had let go of the dough the moment Rafferty entered. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out from behind the counter. Not quickly, not slowly. She walked past Rafferty without looking at him and went to the wooden table in the corner. She picked up the ivory calling card that had been lying face down there for 3 days. She turned it over. She pulled the old phone from the pocket of her apron, pressed each number one by one with the index finger still dusted in flour, and lifted the phone to her ear. 7 pairs of eyes in the bakery watched her. No one stopped her. Rafferty stood still, his head tilted slightly to one side, looking more curious than angry. The line rang once, then twice, then 3 times. Then the voice of a man on the other end, a voice Rosie had not heard in 3 days but had not been able to forget for even 3 hours. Pronto. August. Rosie drew in a breath. No tremor. And she spoke, in Italian, a sentence she had never imagined she would say in her life. A sentence that had been waiting in her throat since the moment grandmother Serafina taught her how to pour the first 3 drops of warm water when she was 6 years old. Zio August. Ho bisogno di te adesso. Uncle August. I need you now. Silence on the other end for exactly half a second. Then August's voice, dry and sharp. 8 minutes. Stay calm. The line went dead. Rosie lowered the phone. Rafferty had heard enough. He did not understand Italian, but he understood adesso. He smiled, a half-smile that revealed the left canine tooth. 8 minutes, he repeated, glancing at the gold watch on his wrist. He won't make it in time, little lady. From Long Island to Brooklyn at midnight, the fastest is 22 minutes. We've got plenty of time to move this conversation somewhere more comfortable, don't we? Rafferty took 1 step toward Rosie. She did not step back. He took another, stopping exactly an arm's length away, then leaned forward, lowering his head until it was nearly level with her eyes, forcing her to bow her head if she wanted to avoid looking directly at him. Rosie did not bow. She lifted her chin by exactly the measure he had lowered his, and their faces stopped less than a handspan apart, close enough that Rafferty could smell the flour still clinging to her hair. 1 minute had passed since the line went dead. Rafferty smiled. He stepped back half a pace and looked her up and down as though she were merchandise being priced. You are braver than my boy described, he said. He came back and told me you were just a silent little bakery girl. But you are not silent at all, are you, Miss Calandra? A small sound escaped Emmy from behind Rafferty when she heard that surname. Rosie heard Emmy, but she did not turn. You know my name, she said. Her voice stayed level, so calm that Rafferty narrowed his eyes slightly. It took you 4 days to find it. Do you understand why it was that hard to find? Because my grandmother hid it. Because my mother buried it in a travel bag in Vermont. Because a family in Chicago tried to erase it from the earth 8 years ago. 2 minutes. Rafferty was no longer smiling. Vermont, he repeated. The car that went over the cliff in 2018. That was you. Rosie did not nod. She did not need to. Rafferty already understood. Who do you think you are threatening, Mr. Donnelly? Do you think I am afraid of you? She continued. I lost my whole family in 8 minutes on a December night. My father, my 14-year-old brother, my mother died in the arms of a stranger nurse after 4 hours. I died that night, Mr. Donnelly. You cannot frighten someone who is already dead. 3 minutes. The words fell into the space of the bakery and landed somewhere inside Rafferty's chest that he had not prepared to guard. He went still. He was a man who had done this work for 18 years. He had heard hundreds of pleas, dozens of counter-threats, a few speeches about morality, but he had never heard a sentence spoken with the stillness of someone describing a truth that could no longer be diminished. He blinked once, only once, but Rosie saw it. 4 minutes. Rafferty gathered himself again. He turned his head toward Emmy, then toward the door, then toward his watch. Your Uncle August, he said, is not going to fly here. We have 3.5 minutes left. Plenty of time for me to get you into the car and leave. Come on. He reached a hand toward Rosie's shoulder. But before he could touch her, a sound came from the street outside. A sound all 7 men in the bakery recognized at the same time. Engines. Not one. The dense, low growl of heavy SUVs braking hard on the frost-slick street. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 5.5 minutes had passed. Rafferty snapped his head toward the door. The bakery window reflected the headlights of 6 black SUVs, stopping in unison along the curb. Headlights still blazing, doors opening in the same beat. The footsteps on the frost were not fast, but steady. Steady in the way no unit can be, unless it has trained together for at least 10 years. 6 minutes. Sonny entered the bakery first. He did not look at Rafferty. He stepped slightly to one side, making room for the man behind him. 4 more came in after Sonny, then 4 more, then 3. 12 men in black coats spread through the small shop in 2 rows, taking every corner without touching a single chair. No weapon was drawn. No one shouted. There was only the sound of leather shoes against tile and the steady breathing of 12 chests that had come to Brooklyn at midnight because of a phone call that lasted 32 seconds. Rafferty recognized this formation. He had heard it described once by his father-in-law, a man who had spoken only a single time in his life about the night in 2007 when this formation appeared at a warehouse on Staten Island and left without a trace. This was not a crew sent to collect debts. This was the team that was called only when the Valentino family had decided a war would end that night. 7 minutes. August stepped down from the first SUV. He closed the door behind him, pulled the collar of his charcoal coat higher, and walked into the bakery through the glass doorway Mateus had replaced only 3 days earlier. The yellow light fell across his face for the second time in 7 days. Rafferty Donnelly, for the first time in his life, understood that he had counted the minutes wrong. August stepped across the threshold, and the air inside the bakery changed at once, the way a room changes pressure when a window is shut in the middle of a storm. He did not speak. He did not look at Rafferty. His gaze settled on Rosie, held there for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be certain she had not been scratched, then moved to Emmy, then to the phone still in Rosie's hand. Done. He gave a small nod toward Sonny. Sonny understood. The 12 men who had come with August, already positioned in the places assigned to them as he entered, moved at the same moment. 6 blocked the doorway. 4 closed in along Rafferty's flanks. The remaining 2, men Rosie would later learn were named Gianni and Lorenzo, circled behind the 6 men in black jackets who had come with Rafferty. What happened in the next 40 seconds was something Rosie would carry for the rest of her life. There was no shouting, no clash of weapons. Not a single drop of blood marked the tile Emmy had scrubbed with vinegar water at 10 that night. Rafferty's 6 men were handled with precision, method, and silence so complete that the 40 seconds passed with nothing but the sound of coats brushing against coats, and the controlled breathing of men trained to work without a word. When Sonny turned back and gave August a nod, all 6 had already been escorted out to the vehicles at the curb without making enough noise to wake the neighbors above. Rafferty stood alone in the middle of the bakery. His men were gone. The cash in his coat pocket was still there, his phone still there, the wedding band still on his finger. But something else was gone, and he understood that before August spoke. He lowered himself to one knee. No one told him to kneel. No one touched his shoulder. Rafferty Donnelly, who had not knelt before anyone in 18 years, bent his knee of his own will, because he understood it was the only act that might allow him to walk out of this place on his own feet. He did not lower the second knee. His back stayed straight, his chin lifted, not in defiance, only the last remnant of a man who had miscounted the minutes. August stood 4 steps away. He did not move closer. He did not need to. His voice came low and even. "You laid a hand on my family's blood, Donnelly. You know what that means." Rafferty did not answer. He bowed his head, pale blue eyes dropping to the tile between his feet. In those 7 seconds, he set his entire life in order. From his marriage to Liam Brennan's daughter in 2009, to the twins born in 2015, to the house in Bay Ridge whose title he had just secured the month before. All of it weighed on a scale that had already begun to tip where he did not want it to go. "But tonight I will not touch you," August continued. His voice did not change, because my niece is standing here. Because tonight is the first time in 8 years she has picked up the phone to call me. I will not spill blood in this shop on the night she calls. Rafferty lifted his head. The pale blue eyes were no longer shards of ice. They were simply the eyes of a man waiting for what came next. "You leave New York in 24 hours, August said. "You take your wife, your 2 children, and you go west. Boston, Chicago, anywhere more than 400 miles from here. Everything you have built in Brooklyn over the last 18 months, from this moment on, belongs to my niece. She will decide what to do with it. That is the only gift you receive from me, Donnelly. You keep your life. You lose what you have. My niece receives what she does not need, but now belongs to her." Rafferty said nothing for 10 seconds. Then he nodded once and rose. He walked to the door between 2 lines of August's men, no one stopping him, no one touching him. At the threshold he paused and turned halfway back toward Rosie. "Sleep well, Miss Calandra," he said. Then he stepped out. Nassau Street received him back into the winter wind. And Brooklyn, on the 4th night, changed hands once again, without anyone beyond the 17 people inside that bakery ever knowing it. The door closed behind Rafferty. August's 12 men remained outside on the sidewalk, lined up along the 6 SUVs with their headlights now dark. and not one of them stepped into the bakery again. Sonny shut the inner door, drew the cream-colored curtain across the glass pane, and stood with his arms folded near the entrance, his back to the other 3 people in the room, the posture of a man standing guard, and also of a man deliberately choosing not to look. The bakery, for the first time all night, returned to itself. The yellow light of the bulb hanging above the kitchen counter, the scent of rising yeast still lingering in the air from the dough Rosie had left unfinished. The wall clock struck 12:06. November in Brooklyn no longer held rain, no longer held wind, only the stillness of a city breathing more slowly toward dawn. Rosie stood in the middle of the bakery. She did not look at August. She did not look at Emmy. She walked slowly, like someone waking from a very long sleep, past the kitchen counter, past the wooden table, and stopped in front of the old upright piano in the far corner. She lifted her hand to the lid and wiped away the dust with the back of her bare hand. Not all of it, only enough for the center of the lid to reveal the original walnut beneath. She opened the piano. The ivory keys had yellowed after years without being touched, but they were still lined up, still waiting. Rosie pulled the small bench forward and sat down. Her feet settled on the pedals. Her hands, still carrying a few traces of dried flour across the backs, rose to the level of the keyboard. She paused there for exactly 1 breath. Then she lowered them. The first note sounded in the bakery, and it was a low C-sharp minor, deep and slow, like an old wooden door being opened after years of staying shut. The second note. The third. Her left hand entered first, the right following 4 beats later. And the melody of Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor began to rise into the air of Miller's hearth at 12:12 in the morning. Emmy sat down in the nearest chair. She did not cry. She did not breathe. She only lifted a hand to cover her mouth and listened, because she had heard this melody before. She had heard it on a July evening in 1989, before she left for America, when a 12-year-old girl named Bianca Calandra played it on the old upright piano in Celestina's mother's sitting room in Naples, and the 3 women in the room had all cried, because none of them knew it would be the last time Emmy ever heard Bianca play. She had heard it a second time on a September night in 2008, at Celestina and August's engagement celebration in the Long Island villa, when Celestina sat at the black grand piano in the drawing room and played it for the man who had just asked her to marry him, in candlelight, and beneath the look August had never given to another person in his life. And now, for the 3rd time, she was hearing it played by the hands she had wrapped in blankets for 3 hours on a rainy night 4 years earlier. 3 women, 1 melody, 3 generations, the same Chopin. August did not sit at the wooden table right away. He stood and listened through 2 phrases, then moved slowly, 1 step at a time, toward the table in the corner. On the table there was still an espresso, not the cup that had gone cold 4 days earlier. Emmy had poured that one out the following morning. This was a new cup, brewed tonight at 11:50, when Rosie, for a reason she herself could not have explained, had left the unfinished dough and gone to the espresso machine, measured exactly 2 spoonfuls of freshly ground coffee, let 3 drops of warm water fall before tamping it down, tamped with exactly 30 pounds of pressure, and poured a small cup to place at the head of the wooden table, not knowing that 10 minutes later the bakery door would open again. That cup of coffee was still warm. The crema still clung in a dark ring around the rim. August sat down. He held the espresso cup in both hands the way a person holds something precious and terribly fragile. He lifted it to eye level and looked into the surface of the coffee beneath the yellow light. Behind him, the Chopin melody moved into the most lyrical passage of the piece, the one Celestina had always lingered over on the nights she played alone in the Long Island drawing room. And Rosie, tonight, did not know that her mother had once lingered in exactly the same way. August closed his eyes, and a single tear slipped from the corner of his right eye, traveled slowly past the temple where a few silver strands had begun to appear, down across the narrow scar at his jaw, and fell onto the wooden tabletop, soaking into an old scratch and disappearing. For the first time in 6 years since the day he closed the lid of his wife's coffin. No one saw that tear. Rosie had her back turned toward the table, her eyes fixed on the piano keys. Emmy was watching Rosie, not August. Sonny stood at the door with his back to the room, but the tear had fallen. And years later, on a summer night in Naples, August would tell Rosie about it while the 2 of them sat on Serafina's balcony drinking espresso at 3 in the morning, and Rosie would only smile softly and say nothing, because by then she had already known. 6 months had passed since that November night. Brooklyn had moved through a winter, a brief spring, and was now stepping into the first weeks of May, when the cherry trees along Nassau Street bloomed in soft white and pink, covering the sidewalks, and the early mornings were no longer cold enough to make delivery drivers rub their hands together. Miller's hearth still opened each night, still with the yellow light falling across the old tiled floor, still with the scent of yeast and melting butter blending into a fragrance only those who stayed awake through the night would truly know. But a few things had changed. By the entrance, beneath the old name sign that Emmy had kept, because it was all that remained of her late husband, a small wooden plaque had been hung the week before, carved by Rosie's own hands. On it were 4 words, 2 hyphens, and a smaller line beneath. Beckett and Calandra, from Naples to Brooklyn, 1952. The year Serafina, Rosie's grandmother, first arrived at the New York harbor on a ship carrying olive oil, with a small leather suitcase and the coffee ritual she would pass down to her daughters 40 years later. Inside the shop, Rosie still worked the night shift. Her brown hair was still gathered low with the same wooden clip, but the faded gray sweater had been replaced by a linen apron in soft beige, embroidered with the small initials R and C in the lower right corner, a gift Emmy had stitched over 3 quiet evenings in January. The gray blue of Rosie's eyes held less exhaustion now. She still spoke little with regular customers, still moved through the shop like a familiar shadow, but she was no longer the invisible Rosie of the past 4 years. She had begun signing her true name on supply contracts in February. Rosalia Calandra Beckett, 3 words instead of 2, and the employee ledger now held 4 names instead of 1. The wooden table in the corner was no longer empty. Every Thursday night, at exactly 11 o'clock, the small brass bell above the door would ring once, clear and bright, and a man in a black suit would step inside. He did not knock. He did not need a reservation. He would remove his coat, hang it on the wooden hook Emmy had installed for him on the wall behind the counter in December, and walk to the table in the corner. On the table, there would already be an espresso waiting. 3 drops of warm water first, 2 spoonfuls of freshly ground coffee, tamped with exactly 30 pounds of pressure. He would sit, hold the cup in both hands, and listen, because across the room, at the old walnut upright piano that Rosie had cleaned and tuned in January, his niece would be playing. Some nights it was Chopin, some nights it was an old Italian lullaby Bianca had once sung to her when she was 6. Some nights it was a melody Rosie had written herself, a melody she had not yet named, one that August listened to without asking about, because in these 6 months he had learned that some things must be left alone to grow on their own. They did not speak much on those Thursday nights. They had lost too many years to things that could not be said, and both understood now that silence was no longer distance, but a language. Sometimes Emmy would step out from the kitchen, place a plate of fresh bread on the table, sit for 5 minutes, then return to her work. Sometimes Sunny would stand at the doorway, nod once to August through the glass, then go back outside to wait in the car. Sometimes a passerby would glance through the window, see an older man in a black suit and a young woman at a piano, wonder who they were to each other, and then walk on, never knowing they had just passed one of the most beautiful stories in Brooklyn on a Thursday night. There are invisible people moving through our lives every day. The night baker, the early morning barista, the hospital floor cleaner, the cashier behind a counter at midnight. We do not know who they were before they stood there. We do not know what they lost to carry the silence they bring with them. We do not know whom they loved, who once loved them, or how many nights they have waited alone for someone who never came. But sometimes, a single cup of coffee made the right way, a May played again after many years, a name spoken in the exact tone of someone who is gone, is enough to awaken an entire past and begin a future. And perhaps, even now, somewhere in your neighborhood, there is a Rosalia kneading dough in a small shop, waiting for a door to open and for someone to walk into the table that has been left empty for years. If tonight's story has touched something in your heart, if you have ever felt invisible in a world that is too loud, or if you know someone who is alone tonight, please leave a like, share this story with those who might need it, and subscribe to our channel to stay with us through stories told in the quietest hours for those who remain awake the longest. We would truly love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about Rosie? About August? About the cup of espresso that waited for 4 years on that wooden table? Leave a comment below to share with us and with others, because each of your words is a small light in a long night. We wish you good health, a peaceful life, and that each day brings at least one moment that makes you smile. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next story.